Here, we just looked at the Tuskegee experiment as well as the Nuremberg trials. And what we found with the Tuskegee experiment, not only did they not get informed consent from the patients, and it ran on for 40 years, and it was just a horrible, hypocritical thing. But the research, like the scientific research that was supposed to be gained, whether or not there was a correlation between spread or whether it spread the same through the black population as the white population, scientists in later years are like, all of that data is bunk and useless. And not only was the experiment itself unethical, but the research was flawed. Well, now we turn to the Jewish chronic disease hospital case run by Dr. Chester Southam, prestigious researcher that he is. And here we have another also very unethical experiment in a different way, but it's undisputed that the research and data he gained was valuable and meaningful. Just like the Nazis who experimented on people and froze people in hypothermia actually did develop like really good winter gear for their Germans, right? So it's kind of one of these questions of like, well, do we throw out the good information we learn from these like unethical things? Or that throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Or is it all, you know, flawed because it was gained under illegitimate circumstances, right? Like in a court of law, you just got to dismiss evidence if it's gained, without the proper procedure. So I'm going to pretty slowly read through most of the elements of the Jewish chronic disease hospital case, just because it illustrates so much of the double speak and the stratification and these hierarchical systems that are at place that I really think it'll bear out and be of benefit. So for those of you who have your textbook, this is on page 712. I'm going to go as fast as I can and hit the points I need to hit, and we'll see where we are at the end. So during the summer of 1963, Chester Southam and DeGracius Custodio together injected live cultured cancer cells into the bodies of 22 debilitated patients in the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. Custodio, a Philippine-born unlicensed medical resident at the hospital, was participating in a medical experiment designed by Southam, a distinguished physician researcher at the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research, an attending physician at the Memorial Hospital in New York City, and associate professor of medicine at Cornell University Medical College. A bigwig. The purpose of the research was to determine whether the previously established immune deficiency of cancer patients was caused by their cancer or alternatively by their debilitated condition. Southam thus looked to a group of non-cancerous but highly debilitated elderly patients who might bear out his guiding hypothesis that cancer, not old age, was the cause of the previously witnessed immune system deficiency. And we're going to explain what he's looking for here. Importantly, he believed on the basis of long experience that the injection of cultured cancer cells posed no risk to these patients, and that all the cells would eventually be rejected by their immune system. So I was like, all right, we're going to stick some foreign cancer into a person, maybe in their neck or in their arm, and we're going to see how long it takes their body to expel it. He's not worried that the cancer is going to become dormant or spread or metastasize. He's done it, and see, he's done this before. Although Southern's professional credentials were impeccable, although his work was deemed by his peers to be of the utmost scientific importance, the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital experiment soon erupted into a major public controversy. His methods were denounced and compared to the physicians at Nuremberg, while his defenders countered that he was a distinguished physician researcher, and by all accounts an honorable man who merely had the bad luck to be caught in the shifting riptides of history. And although the case is almost always briefly mentioned in published litanies of important research scandals, it has never been the exclusive subject of any full-length scholarly paper, let alone a book. So, Sutherland's research project focused on the relationship between the immune system and cancer. Beginning in 1954, Sutherland had performed numerous studies on more than 300 cancer patients at a memorial hospital and on hundreds of healthy prison volunteers at an Ohio state penitentiary. So it later came out that he did not say he lacked consent from those 300 people at the memorial hospital as well. It subsequently comes out. He actually had gotten consent from the prisoners and told them, I am injecting you with cancer. But he did not tell the people at the hospital he was injecting them with cancer. He must know best, right? So he had chosen cultured cancer cells for these experiments because they possessed the necessary uniformity, reproducibility, comparability, and growth potential to cause measurable reaction in patients. Whereas the immune systems of healthy volunteers would normally reject such foreign tissue completely and promptly in roughly 4 to 6 weeks, it took cancer patients much longer, often 12 weeks or longer, to finally reject the injected cells. Got it. If a woodchuck could chuck wood, saw them worry about a gap in his data. Was the delayed immune response in cancer patients due to their cancer, or was it due instead to the fact that most patients were elderly, debilitated, and chronically ill? In order to fill this gap of knowledge, he proposed to repeat his immune study on a group of non-cancerous but elderly debilitated patients. He hypothesized that this elderly population would reject the injected material at the same rate as the healthy volunteers, 4 to 6 weeks. He hoped these studies such as this would ultimately lead to progress in our ability to boost the human immune system's defenses against cancer. To test his hypothesis, Southern contacted Mandel, who was then director of the Department of Medicine at the Jewish Parentheses Hospital case, eager to affiliate his modest hospital with the work of a famous doctor at a prestigious medical institution. Mandel immediately agreed to provide the requisite number of chronically ill patients for Southern's study. Like many of the studies criticized in Henry Beecher's famous whistleblowing expose in the New England Journal of Medicine, this project was to be funded by eminently respectable sources, including the American Cancer Society and the U.S. Public Health Service. There they are. God bless the PHS. At their first meeting to discuss the study, Southern explained to Mandel that his proposal was not related to the care and treatment of patients. For your notes, that was, in other words, a pure example of non-therapeutic research. Some also informed Mandel that it would not be necessary to obtain written informed consent for the patients, since these immunological studies have become routine at Memorial Hospital. He also noted that there was no need to inform these elderly patients that the injected material consists of live cultured cancer cells, because that would be of no consequence to them. I really should be giving you guys air quotes when it's appropriate. On the basis of his considerable prior experience of such studies with patients and prisoners, which easily included more than 600 subjects, Southern was convinced that the injection of cultured cancer cells from another person posed no discernible risk of transmitting cancer. In his opinion, it was simply a question of when, not whether, such injected cells would eventually be rejected by the patient's immune systems. Since in his view, subjects would not be placed at risk by his study, Southern saw no need to inform them specifically that live cancer cells would be injected to their bodies. The whole point of using cancer cells had to do with their special properties. Within the context of his research project, no one, he opined, was actually at risk of getting cancer. Good thing he knows. Prior to initiating the study, Mandel hit a little wrench in the gears, if you will. Mandel had asked 3 young staff physicians at the hospital, Kagan, Lichter, and Fursto, to help with the injections of live cancer cells into the hospital's debilitated patients. All 3 had refused to cooperate on the ground that, in their view, informed consent could not be obtained from the potential subjects that Mandel and Southern had in mind to study. Undeterred, Mandel and Southern forged ahead, eventually settling upon the unlicensed and comparatively vulnerable house officer Custodio to help with the injections. On July 16, 1963, they initiated the study. They had already selected the 22 chronically ill patients to be asked to participate. Southern demonstrated the injection procedure on the first 3 patients, and then Custodio proceeded to inject the remaining 19 with 2 separate doses of tissue cultured cells. Isn't it fascinating? They find some like third person to do the injections. It's like, what are you guys doing here? Why don't you, hands off? Is that it? Uh, According to Southern and Custodio, each patient was told that the injections were being given to test their immune capacity. There was no mention of research, and then a small nodule would likely form at the site of the injection, but would eventually disappear. In the investigators' view, this constituted sufficient oral consent to participate in the study. At the end of just 2 hours, 22 debilitated patients on 6 floors of 2 separate hospital buildings had received injections. With the passage of a few weeks, Southern's hypothesis would be fully vindicated. with the exception of patients who had died shortly after receiving their injections. All of the patients rejected the foreign tissue as completely and at the same rate as the prior group of physically healthy individuals. The gap in the data was filled. It was cancer, not debilitation and chronic illness, that was responsible for the impaired immune system. None of the patients, moreover, experienced any long-lasting physical harms attributable to the study. So, got oral consent, didn't tell him what he was injecting them, didn't tell him the purpose of it, but none of them died, it seems, from the cancer. It was rejected, the research gap was filled, science is furthered. Did he get what constitutes informed consent orally? So, news of the study spread quickly along the corridors of the hospital. Samuel Rosenfeld, chief of medicine, was outraged both by the nature of the study and the fact that he had been consulted of three physicians who had rebuffed Solomon Mandel, Kagan, Fursko, and Leichter, fearing that their silence might be construed as condoning the search, resigned in block less than 6 weeks after the injection. All three were Jewish. Leichter was a Holocaust survivor, and the other two had lost many family members to Nazi violence during the catastrophe of World War II. Pay attention to this spot. Each subsequently attributed his negative response to the study to a visceral revulsion at the thought of using such debilitated and helpless patients in experiments without their consent. No one had had any training in ethics or law during medical studies, and even Kagan subsequently admitted that none of them had even heard of the Nuremberg Code. Very strange. But they still knew there something was wrong, right? So the hospital's grievance committee judged that the resignations of these three were irresponsible and therefore should be accepted by the hospital. Break that one down in your head. The committee then fully and enthusiastically endorsed the scientific and medical importance of Southern's research and concluded that the allegations of the three young doctors and the medical director against Mandel and Southern were baseless. Later that month, the board of directors approved the report, and 4 months later, the research committee approved the continuation of the study, but only on the condition that he obtained the written consent of all subjects in the study. So literally, they have a board of people who come and look at this and like, oh no, seems like everything's up and up. You know, he's following best practices in the profession. Got oral consent, even though with everything we're reading. Everyone's like, yeah, we love it. We love this connection with a prestigious, distinguished physician researcher. Growing desperate, they turn to a lawyer who'd helped found the hospital, and the lawyer pushes and pushes and pushes, and eventually he seeks the minutes of the grievance committee meeting that had gone so well as the medical records of all the patients enlisted in the study. He pushes and pushes, and eventually he gets it opened. And in its 1965 inquiry into the case, the grievance committee focuses on two major issues: the assessment of risk to patients and the quality of informed consent. So offers strong arguments on both fronts. And first, we look at the inclination risk. So Sullivan basically makes the claim that the presence or absence of risk in the study. Some argued that the injection of cultured cancer cells from an extraneous source into the human body posed no appreciable risk. His 10 years of prior experience with more than 600 subjects had led him to conclude that it's biologically and medically impossible to cause cancer by this means. The regents concurred, yada yada yada, established to their own satisfaction that prior to the study, medical opinion was unanimous that the patients were running no risk of contracting cancer and hence need not be cautioned that there was any such risk. Medical opinion at the time was not, however, entirely unanimous on the question of risk, as it hardly ever is on any question worthy of public debate. Worth remembering that. Another reason to doubt Southern's unequivocal denial of any risk in this experiment was the fact that in one of his own previous studies, the injected cancer cells had migrated 10 inches up the arm of a subject from an injection site to a nearby lymph node. The patient in question had died shortly thereafter, but there was some speculation at the time that had the patient lived, cancer cells that had migrated that far might have been subsequently disseminated through the body via the lymphatic system, which would not be good. Although Southern claimed that the cells would not have traveled beyond the lymph node if the patient lived, he admitted that he could not settle the matter with a statement based on fact. quote. Love it. But perhaps the most telling and unintentionally humorous admission that Southern made regarding the possibility of risk came when he said, while emphasizing Southern's confidence that there was no theoretical likelihood that the injections would cause cancer, the article also noted Southern's unwillingness to inject himself or his colleagues. But let's face it, there are relatively few skilled cancer researchers, and it seems stupid to take even the little risk. To which Southern responded, I deny the quote. I'm sure I didn't say, let's face it. I'm not sure you didn't. So they then look at what were the standards for informed consent and the professional norms at that time. And Southern came out of this very paternalistic, culture, right? And especially when patients are super sick, it was kind of the physician takes the role and does what he thinks needs to. And in the clinical setting, truthful information regarding risks were considered less as an ethical or legal matter and more as a matter of therapeutics. If the risks were small, physicians would likely conclude that informed consent was not necessary, since if they believed that the information in question would upset or depress the patient. If the risks were great, or if physicians needed the patient to be informed in order to better collaborate on recovery, then information would be medically indicated. Love it. According to this paternalistic physician ethic, information regarding risks was viewed as essentially one more tool in the physician's black bag. Truth-telling was a matter of individual physician discretion, and the relevant yardstick for disclosure was the perceived benefit or harm of disclosing information bearing on the patient's medical condition. So, against the backdrop of this professional practice, Southern's duty seemed clear. The risk of injecting cancer cells into the bodies of frail elderly patients was, in his view, infinitesimally small, perhaps even non-existent. Were he to announce to these patients that he was about to inject them with live cancer cells, such a disclosure would have advanced no legitimate medical purpose, while only serving to make the elderly physicians very upset and anxious. In those days, physicians tended to avoid the dreaded words cancer when talking to their patients, referring instead to speak cryptically of nodes, cysts, or growths. It was standard medical practice to envelope patients in a conspiracy of silence in order to shield them from information that was perceived to be alarming, depressing, or otherwise harmful. So, since using the word cancer was irrelevant to the actual state of affairs, since there was little to no risk, and since the dreaded word would only serve needlessly to alarm patients, some believed disclosure of the cell's derivation to be medically contraindicated. Vernacular. In reaching this conclusion, Southern insisted he was merely acting in the best tradition of responsible clinical practice. It's important to note that the notion of medical relevance, therefore, that the notion of medical relevance advanced here by Southern was reportedly objective and scientific rather than subjective. And the arbiter of what counts as medically relevant objective information was, in his opinion, the physician, who also happens to be a researcher, not the individual patient subject. So here you have Southern literally defending himself, saying, no, I'm just doing what's done in best practices of medicine. And he's currently one of the world's leading cancer researchers, yeah? And so when this happens, a view of researchers' obligations to subjects was confirmed by a parade of distinguished witnesses on his behalf before the tribunal of the Board of Regents, high-ranking medical officers and practitioners at such prestigious institutions as Memorial Hospital, Cornell University, West Virginia Medical Center, the University of Pennsylvania, and on and on and on, all expressed their complete agreement with Southern's central conclusions. Specifically, that his research was of high scientific and social merit, there was no appreciable risk to subjects, and that informed consent was a matter for individual physician discretion. That disclosure of information should be titrated according to the level of risk posed by research, and that the word cancer was generally avoided so as to not upset patients. And then you got a bunch of journalists who can come out and are just like, it would be a shame if a squabble over who told what to whom to destroy a thrilling lead in cancer research. But literally, he's got all the right people firing for him, right? All of Glaucon's, secret societies and political and and journalists and professors come forward. Now they look at the issue of consent. And I'm only going to read a couple of these. None of the residents were told the purpose of the injection or that they were to be told about to participate in a research project. I can speak. Or that they were told they were about to participate in a research project having nothing to do with their own health and well-being. Each was told, however, that they were about to receive an injection designed to test their immune capacity, and soon a nodule would form that would go away in a short time. So one of the questions was, were all these patients even able to give informed consent if they were competent to be able to give informed consent? Did they have DMC, decision-making capacity? And it looks like they did not. The chief of medicine testified that 18 of the patients were mentally incapable of giving consent. Some of them describe a 67-year-old patient with poor cerebration who'd been in a depressive state for a year. Another one's a 63-year-old patient with advanced Parkinson's disease, low mentality, and lack of insight and judgment. Another had a history of depressive psychosis and had been diagnosed at the hospital suffering from dementia praecox and unsound judgment. Another was a diagnosis of post-encephalitic Parkinson's, difficulty in communicating, constant falling, suicidal ideation, and considerable sedation throughout the years. While it's at least theoretically conceivable that each one of these debilitated patients was lucid during the brief interview with Custodio on that summer day for oral consent, they concluded that no, these patients could not have understood such complex matters in a mere 1 to 5 minute encounter. Yeah, seems reasonable. So when the board met the first time, like, oh, okay, you can continue at Southern, but you need to get written consent this time. It's like, oh, do we need to get written consent? Can't we just talk to the people with poor mental? So this time around, the board rules that, oh, go figure, these patients weren't capable of giving informed consent. It just wasn't a thing. And then they look at his omission of the word cancer. And he's making the case that, like, this is within the physician's therapeutic privilege, essentially, right, to do this if he thinks it's medically contraindicated. And he's kind of invoking this, like, patient-physician relationship. And they raise the question that, he's not even the physician for these patients. He's a bloody researcher from another university who just co-opted Mandel to get these people, right? So he says, Southern may have professed a concern to shield these patients from any undue emotional stress during the time when doctors often shielded patients from bad news, particularly about cancer. But they were not his patients. He was essentially an interloper at the hospital who had never previously met the 22 injected residents, let alone had a long-standing professional relationship with him. Thus, they had no right to help themselves to the wide-ranging discretion normally allowed at the time to physicians charged with pursuing the best interests of their patients. So it's interesting, right? He's not even being a doctor here; he's being a researcher. And so they go on, and in the resolution, the final verdict was both physicians were guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct in the practice of medicine. They had allowed their zeal for research to override the basic rights and immunities of a human person, and rendered their verdict. The regents then considered the severity of punishment. Most of them were down for letting him off easily, or no punishment. In the final action, they voted that to suspend the medical licenses of both Southern and Mandel for 1 year, a stinging rebuke, especially to Southern, who was at the time a grandee of the New York and national communities of cancer research. The regents softened this punishment considerably, however, by staying the license suspensions on the condition that the physicians stayed out of trouble for the next year, during which time they remain on probation. So they didn't even get their licenses suspended. That's awesome. And the denouement is really the most awesome. That means resolution in the old language. French. Events subsequent to the resolution of the case proved just rated with ambiguity. Remember those physicians, Kagan and First, the courageous young residents who refused to cooperate, were rewarded for their efforts with exclusion from the American College of Physicians. They were kicked out for refusing to participate in what later came out as an unethical experiment. So it's been proven it was unethical, and still they're being kicked out of the American College of Physicians. Very interesting. As Preminger reports, their exclusion was doubtless prompted by the refusal to cooperate in the experiment and their subsequent irresponsible resignations from the staff. I want your head to not explode and to just digest what they're saying. They appealed, and their exclusion was eventually reversed on the ground that their overreaction to the experiment was excusable in light of their family's Holocaust situations. These all too rare profiles of courage were thus trivialized by the governors of the American College of Physicians, reduced to the status of merely exculpatory psychological pathology. So what the bleep are they saying? The three dissenters had refused to cooperate in wrongdoing, apparently because of any allegiance to an ethical principle or the basic rights of the human person, but rather because the proposal had triggered their memories of the Holocaust, which in turn caused their irresponsible behavior. So good Lord, even at the end of this, they're still getting buried. And it's, oh, you weren't being honorable or principled or ethical. You were being impulsive and emotional. And because you were being irresponsible and emotional, we will let you back into our College of Physicians. Oh, aren't you glad to be a part of that organization? And what about Hyman, the lawyer who got this all out? He was refused perfunctory re-election to the hospital's board of trustees, even though he narrowly won his lawsuit, and even though the larger issues for which he fought were eventually vindicated. His fellow trustees expelled him from the board of a hospital he'd helped to found. So I hope you guys are taking lessons on being whistleblowers and speaking up, because it is risky. And as you know, I think that there's a half dozen moments in life that your life will come down to where you have to decide between, you have to do ethics, you have to resolve conflicting values. And it might be rough for you, right? You might not get the benefits of doing the right thing, even if you do the right thing. Remember, three categories. But the most remarkable historical irony was reserved for Saddam himself. Having been publicly humiliated by an inquisition before the New York State Board of Regents, having been found guilty of fraud, deceit, and the unprofessional conduct of medicine, and having had his medical license suspended and placed on probation, as his lawyer put it, like some lowbrow scoundrel. Chester M. Southern was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research in 1968, just a year or two after all of this. And so, oh my lord, that is the tale. I mean, that's what happened with Harry Harlow, the monkey experiments at UW-Madison 30, 40 years ago. It was shut down, declared unethical, and then what? Was he nominated president of the American Psychological Association? Pretty sure he was. So, the research that came out of the experiment was super valid, but it was found to be highly unethical on multiple fronts. And it's interesting to watch how the system and the forces work to defend this man, right? And even after it comes out that it is unethical, they just promote him, you know? So I'll be interested to see what you guys' thoughts are.